It was a bright Tuesday afternoon when Judge Marcus Wright decided to drive home after a long day at the courthouse. He had just finished overseeing a difficult case, and the weight of his job was on his mind. As he cruised down the street, his thoughts drifted to his family and the upcoming weekend. He was looking forward to some much-needed rest. As he turned onto a quiet side street in his neighborhood, he suddenly saw flashing red and blue lights appear in his rearview mirror. It took him by surprise, but he didn't panic. It was a routine traffic stop after all. He had been pulled over a few times before, just like anyone else. He slowed down and carefully steered his car to the side of the road, parking it near the curb. Judge Wright took a deep breath, ready to handle the situation calmly, as he always did. He rolled down his window and waited for the officer to approach. He could see the police car's headlights in his side mirror as the officer walked toward him. The officer looked young, maybe in his late 20s. He had a serious expression on his face, and his uniform was crisp and neat. When the officer reached the window, he didn't smile or greet Judge Wright. Instead, he began speaking in a stern voice. "Good afternoon, sir. I pulled you over because you were driving a bit too fast for this area. May I see your driver's license and registration?" he said, his tone a little sharper than usual. Judge Wright nodded and reached for his glove compartment to pull out the documents. He knew the drill. "Of course, officer," he said politely. He handed over his driver's license and the car's registration papers. There was nothing unusual about the stop, or so he thought. However, as the officer took the documents, he glanced at them quickly, his eyes narrowing for a brief moment. Judge Wright noticed this, but chose to ignore it. After all, maybe the officer was just being cautious. The officer didn't immediately return the documents, and instead he asked, "Where are you headed, sir? You're not from around here, are you?" This question made Judge Wright pause for a moment. He wasn't used to being asked about his destination. He had lived in this area for years, and it was a neighborhood he knew well. "Still," he answered, "I'm heading home from the courthouse. I live just a few blocks away." The officer didn't seem satisfied with the answer. His eyes lingered on Judge Wright's face, as if searching for something. Judge Wright, a little confused by the question, tried to stay calm. He didn't know why the officer was being so probing, but he didn't want to make the situation worse. "Is everything okay, officer?" Judge Wright asked, his voice calm but now tinged with a hint of uncertainty. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the car's rearview mirror and then at the paperwork in his hands. There was an awkward silence between them, and Judge Wright could feel the tension building. He didn't know it yet, but this was about to turn into something much bigger than just a simple traffic stop. Officer Doug Harris had always thought he understood people. He had been a police officer for 5 years, and in that time, he had developed a strong belief in his own ability to judge a situation. But something about this stop felt different. It wasn't just the fact that the driver was black, although for some reason, that fact did stand out in his mind. It was something about the way the man looked. He didn't quite match the image Harris had in his head of what people in this neighborhood should look like. Harris had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. He wasn't used to seeing people like Judge Wright in places like this. The area they were in was quiet, with beautiful homes and well-maintained gardens. Harris had a certain idea about who lived here, and Judge Wright didn't fit that idea. In his mind, people from this neighborhood were supposed to be a certain way, and this man didn't look the part. As the officer glanced down at the documents Judge Wright handed him, his thoughts wandered. Harris had been taught to be aware of potential dangers in his job, but his bias had grown stronger over time. He didn't even realize that his assumptions about Judge Wright were colored by the stereotypes he had heard growing up. He wasn't consciously trying to be rude or disrespectful, but his thoughts had already created a wall of doubt. The more he looked at the driver, the more his mind filled with questions. Why was this man here? What was he doing in this part of town? Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this situation. He tried to keep his focus, but his mind kept wandering back to the idea that something wasn't right. He thought he could read people. His experience had taught him to look for certain signs. And yet, with Judge Wright, everything seemed to go against what he expected. The man was calm, polite, and well-spoken. That didn't fit the image Harris had in his head. Harris had worked with many different people, and most of them didn't act like this. The more the officer thought about it, the more it unsettled him. As Harris began to ask questions about the judge's destination, he couldn't help but wonder if the answers were true. He knew it was an unnecessary question, one he didn't need to ask, but something inside him pushed him to continue. "Are you sure you're headed to the courthouse?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling in his gut that this wasn't a routine stop. Judge Wright, sensing the officer's growing discomfort, kept his answers short and clear. He had dealt with enough awkward situations to know when someone was questioning his authority. But instead of showing frustration, Wright chose to remain calm. He wasn't going to let the officer's questions throw him off. Harris, still fixated on the idea that something wasn't quite right, continued with his questioning. His assumptions were starting to cloud his judgment, and he didn't realize how unfairly he was treating the man in front of him. What was supposed to be a simple traffic stop was beginning to feel more complicated, but for all the wrong reasons. As the officer stood by the car, his questions grew more pointed, and the silence between them seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. Judge Wright, although still polite, could sense the unease in the officer's voice. His patience was wearing thin. He had been pulled over many times before, but never had a stop felt so uncomfortable. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just about the speed limit. "Are you sure you're not lost?" Officer Harris asked again, his voice still heavy with suspicion. Judge Wright gave him a steady look. He had answered the question clearly, but the officer seemed determined to push further. "I'm not lost, officer," Judge Wright replied calmly. "I live just a few blocks away. I've been through this area many times before." The officer didn't seem satisfied with this answer. Instead, he stepped back a little and stared at Judge Wright for a moment, almost as if he was inspecting him. The tension in the air grew thicker. For a second, it felt as if time had slowed down. Judge Wright sat quietly, trying not to show the frustration bubbling up inside him. He had spent years working in the legal system, dealing with complex cases and difficult situations, but this felt like something entirely different. Harris glanced down at the paperwork again, his mind still running with questions he didn't have the right to ask. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the man he was talking to. His own doubts were growing, and instead of focusing on the facts, he allowed his suspicions to cloud his judgment. "Where exactly were you coming from?" "You said the courthouse, but what's the case?" Harris pressed further. Judge Wright felt the tension rising in the conversation, but he didn't let it show. He had encountered situations where people tried to question his authority, and he wasn't about to let this officer get away with disrespecting him. Still, he remained composed, his voice steady as he responded. "I just finished a case at the courthouse. I'm on my way home, officer," Judge Wright said firmly. "There's no need for all these questions. I've answered everything you've asked." Harris hesitated. His gaze flickered between Judge Wright and the paperwork, and for a brief moment, he looked unsure of what to do next. He was starting to realize that he might be making a mistake, but his pride and discomfort pushed him to keep going. It was as if his mind was telling him to keep questioning, to look for something that wasn't there. The silence between them stretched on again. The longer it lasted, the more uncomfortable it became. People walking by on the sidewalk began to notice the stop, glancing over at the scene. The officer seemed to be growing more agitated with each passing second, but Judge Wright remained calm. He was used to staying composed under pressure, even when faced with unfair treatment. At that moment, he knew he had to decide. Continue to let the officer push him around or stand up for himself and challenge the unfairness he was facing. The atmosphere between the officer and Judge Wright was thick with unspoken tension. The questions kept coming, and each one seemed to dig deeper, though they were unnecessary and irrelevant. Judge Wright could feel the frustration rising inside him, but he kept his calm demeanor. After all, he had seen much worse in the courtroom, where people's lives were on the line. This wasn't the first time he had been treated unfairly. Still, this situation felt different. It wasn't just a question of authority. It was something personal. As Officer Harris continued to ask about the judge's destination and reason for being in the neighborhood, the silence grew louder. Judge Wright knew that the officer's assumptions were not based on facts, but rather on prejudice. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply been driving home after work, yet this officer seemed determined to make him feel out of place. The officer seemed to grow more frustrated as his questions were met with the same calm, concise responses. Finally, Harris decided to run Judge Wright's license and registration through the system, hoping to find something that would justify his suspicions. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the moment that would change everything. As the officer stepped away to make the call, Judge Wright sat quietly in his car, feeling a strange mix of anger and disbelief. He had been stopped countless times before, but the way this officer was acting, his questioning, his tone, his body language, was making it clear that this was not just a routine traffic stop. There was something more to it, and Judge Wright knew it was tied to his race. The officer, unaware of the identity of the man he was questioning, spoke briefly into his radio. As the minutes passed, Judge Wright began to wonder if the officer was simply stalling or if he was trying to find a reason to make the stop last longer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to Judge Wright's window. His expression had changed. The doubt and suspicion in his eyes were replaced with a kind of forced politeness. "I just ran your information through dispatch," Harris said, his voice now much softer. "It seems you're Judge Marcus Wright." Judge Wright, surprised by the officer's sudden shift in tone, nodded. "Yes, that's correct." The officer's face flushed red as he realized his mistake. He had been so focused on his assumptions and his prejudice that he had failed to recognize who Judge Wright was. He now knew that he had just pulled over a respected judge, someone who had spent years working to ensure fairness in the courtroom. But there was no apology, no clear sign that the officer understood how wrong he had been. The officer hesitated for a moment, looking down at the papers in his hands. He had been so sure that something was wrong, but now that he knew who Judge Wright was, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. The tension that had been building was now replaced with discomfort. Harris didn't know what to say next. The moment the officer realized who Judge Marcus Wright was, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as an uncomfortable traffic stop quickly became a moment of reflection for Officer Harris. He had made a mistake, and now he had to face the reality of his actions. The officer stood there, staring at the judge, unsure of what to say next. The silence was heavy, almost too heavy. Judge Wright, however, didn't let the awkwardness stop him. He had dealt with uncomfortable situations before, especially in his line of work as a judge. But this wasn't just any situation. He knew the officer's questions had been unfair and driven by bias. Wright had remained calm up until now, but it was time to take control of the situation and make sure this wasn't just another incident that would be swept under the rug. "I think you should call for a supervisor," Judge Wright said, his voice firm but composed. The officer hesitated. He wasn't sure how to respond. Was this a request or an order? But there was no mistaking the authority in Judge Wright's voice. Harris knew that he had been wrong, and now he was being asked to fix the mistake. He wasn't about to argue. With a heavy sigh, the officer turned away and radioed for a supervisor. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew it was the right thing to do. It was clear that he had overstepped his bounds. And as much as he tried to hide his discomfort, the officer couldn't ignore the fact that the situation had spiraled out of his control. While waiting for the supervisor to arrive, Judge Wright stayed in his car, his hands resting on the steering wheel. His mind was racing, not with anger, but with a sense of disbelief. He couldn't believe what had just happened. How could an officer in his own community make such an assumption about him? How could someone in law enforcement, a person who should understand fairness, act in such a biased way? The officer, standing a few feet away, appeared uneasy. He glanced over at Judge Wright several times but didn't say anything. The tension was thick between them. Wright knew that the officer was feeling uncomfortable, but that didn't change the fact that the officer's actions had been wrong. He wasn't going to let this slide, not without some accountability. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a car pulled up behind the police cruiser. A new voice broke the silence. Sergeant Linda Graham, the supervisor. She stepped out of her vehicle and quickly assessed the situation. She looked at Harris, then at Judge Wright, before making her way over to the window. The officer, still standing nearby, didn't speak, but he was clearly relieved to see the supervisor. Sergeant Graham turned her attention to Judge Wright, who had already begun to gather his thoughts for what he was about to say. "Good afternoon, sir," Sergeant Graham said respectfully. "I'm Sergeant Graham. I understand there's been an issue here." Judge Wright took a deep breath, his frustration still simmering beneath the surface, but his voice remained calm and steady. "Yes, officer," he replied, looking directly at her. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding, and I'd like to make sure this doesn't happen again." Sergeant Graham listened carefully as Judge Wright explained the situation. He told her about the officer's questions, about the unnecessary interrogation, and about how uncomfortable the entire encounter had been. Graham nodded, taking in every word. She had heard about these kinds of situations before, but hearing it firsthand made it clear that the officer's actions were far from acceptable. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Sergeant Graham said after a moment. "I'll make sure this is addressed properly." While Judge Wright was still upset, he felt a small sense of relief. At least now, someone was listening. The minutes felt like hours as Judge Wright sat in his car, waiting for the supervisor to arrive. Officer Harris had stepped away, his radio crackling as he called for help, but the silence that followed only made the situation more uncomfortable. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of cars on the main road was the only noise that broke the stillness. Judge Wright stayed calm, but his thoughts were racing. How could this officer, someone who was supposed to protect and serve, treat him with such disrespect? Was this how the system treated everyone, or was it just him because of his race? These were the questions that lingered in his mind, and though he had answered them countless times in his career, this moment felt different. It wasn't just a matter of law. It was a matter of dignity. When the car finally pulled up behind the police cruiser, Judge Wright looked up to see a woman in a police uniform step out of the vehicle. She was taller than the officer, with a confident stride and a no-nonsense expression. Her uniform was neatly pressed, and she looked at the scene before her with a careful, experienced eye. This was clearly someone in charge, someone who could handle the situation. Sergeant Linda Graham walked toward Judge Wright's car with purpose. She didn't hesitate, and there was no sign of the discomfort that had clearly been affecting Officer Harris. The officer, standing awkwardly a few steps away, didn't speak. Instead, he let Sergeant Graham take over. "Good afternoon, sir," Sergeant Graham said, her voice professional but calm. "I'm Sergeant Graham. I understand there's been a bit of confusion. How can I help?" Judge Wright took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. This was his chance to address the situation, to make sure that the officer's actions didn't go unnoticed. He knew he had to stay calm, but his frustration was bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm Judge Marcus Wright," he began, his voice steady. "I was stopped by Officer Harris for a traffic violation. The stop started normally, but soon I realized that the officer was asking questions that didn't make sense, questions about where I was going and why I was in this area. I explained that I was on my way home from the courthouse, but the officer kept questioning me as though I didn't belong here." Sergeant Graham listened carefully, her face serious, as she absorbed every word. She had clearly dealt with situations like this before, but hearing it firsthand from someone of Judge Wright's stature made it clear that something needed to be done. "I see," Sergeant Graham said after a moment of thought. "I'm sorry for the way you've been treated, Judge Wright. I understand how this must have been upsetting for you. Let me assure you that this kind of behavior is not acceptable in our department." Judge Wright nodded, though his frustration remained. "I don't believe this should have happened in the first place. I've been through this area hundreds of times, and I've never had an issue. It's not just about me. It's about how officers treat people and how they're trained to approach situations like this." Sergeant Graham glanced over at Officer Harris, who was still standing off to the side, looking uneasy. She turned back to Judge Wright and spoke again, her voice firm. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. We take these kinds of complaints very seriously. I will make sure that Officer Harris's behavior is reviewed and that proper steps are taken to prevent something like this from happening again. You should never have to feel uncomfortable or unfairly treated during a routine traffic stop." Though Judge Wright was still upset, he could sense that Sergeant Graham was sincere. She wasn't brushing him off or making excuses. Instead, she was listening to him and taking action. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate your time, Sergeant," Judge Wright said, his voice still calm, but with a note of gratitude. "I hope this matter is addressed, so no one else has to go through what I just did." Sergeant Graham nodded. "I'll make sure of it. Thank you for your patience, Judge." With that, the supervisor turned to Officer Harris, who was now looking even more uncomfortable than before. Sergeant Graham didn't waste any time addressing him, and Judge Wright knew that the officer's actions were about to have consequences. While he hadn't yet received the apology he felt he deserved, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. He had made his point, and now it was time for change. The news of the traffic stop quickly spread through the community. What started as a routine interaction between a police officer and a driver had turned into something much bigger. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere, on TV, social media, and even in the papers. Judge Marcus Wright, a respected figure in the community, had become the focus of a story that highlighted the ongoing problem of racial profiling and police bias. At first, Judge Wright wasn't sure how he felt about the attention. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, especially for something like this. But as the days passed, he realized that his experience had struck a chord with many people. They saw the same patterns he had seen over the years, the same biases, the same unfair treatment. It was clear that this wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger. Several community leaders and activists reached out to him, offering their support and urging him to speak out. They knew that Judge Wright's voice carried weight, and they believed he could make a difference. After much thought, Judge Wright decided to take action. He knew that staying silent wouldn't solve anything. If he had the opportunity to spark a change, he couldn't ignore it. A few days later, Judge Wright agreed to a televised interview. The room was quiet as the cameras were set up, and the lights adjusted. He sat in front of the reporter, trying to steady his nerves. This wasn't a courtroom, and he wasn't delivering a legal ruling. This was personal, and he knew that his words could have an impact. The interview began, and the reporter wasted no time in asking about the traffic stop. "Judge Wright, many people have been shocked by the way you were treated during the stop. What do you think about this incident, and what do you want people to understand?" Judge Wright took a deep breath, his mind focused. He could feel the weight of the question, but he was ready. "I've spent my life in the legal system, working to ensure fairness and justice," he began. "And for the first time in my life, I was treated as though I didn't belong. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. It was a moment that showed how deeply ingrained biases can be, even within the people who are supposed to protect and serve us." He paused for a moment, looking directly into the camera. "This happens every day. It's not just about me. It's about the countless people who are treated unfairly because of their race. It's about the people who feel like they don't have a voice. I'm using mine to speak up, and I hope that others will do the same." The reporter nodded, clearly moved by his words. "What do you think needs to change in law enforcement to prevent situations like this from happening?" Judge Wright's response was clear and direct. "We need accountability. We need police officers to be held to the highest standard of fairness and respect. We need better training to recognize and combat biases. It's not enough to simply say we support equality. We have to show it every single day. And most importantly, we need to create a system where everyone, regardless of their race, feels safe and valued. His words resonated deeply with many people who were watching. Social media buzzed with support, and the story continued to gain attention. What had started as a personal experience of unfair treatment had turned into a public call for change. Judge Wright wasn't done yet. He knew this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that needed to happen in every community, every police department, and every court. His goal wasn't just to speak out, but to inspire others to stand up and demand a justice system that truly served everyone equally. In the days that followed Judge Wright's public statement, the city was filled with conversations about the traffic stop. People were discussing the incident at their workplaces, schools, and in their homes. The topic of racial profiling and police bias was on everyone's mind. It wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was part of a larger national conversation about fairness in law enforcement. Officer Doug Harris, who had been at the center of this incident, now found himself under scrutiny. The moment the story went public, it didn't take long for the police department to launch an internal investigation into his conduct. Sergeant Linda Graham, who had arrived at the scene after the altercation, had already taken note of the officer's behavior and was among those involved in the review process. She understood how serious the situation was and knew that actions needed to be taken to ensure accountability. Harris, who had initially brushed off his actions as part of the job, was now facing consequences. The internal investigation found that his behavior during the traffic stop violated department policies on fairness and respect. His actions were deemed to be a result of racial bias, an issue that had to be addressed. He was summoned to meet with the department's internal affairs team, where they explained the findings of their investigation. During the meeting, Harris was asked to reflect on his actions and to explain why he had treated Judge Wright the way he did. He was given a chance to defend himself, but there was no denying that his questions had been based on assumptions and stereotypes. The evidence was clear, and Harris had no choice but to admit that his actions had been wrong. He had let his biases guide his decisions, and that was something he would have to face. The department's leadership, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, decided to take immediate action. Officer Harris was placed on paid leave while a plan was made for further training. The department was committed to ensuring that something like this never happened again. Harris was required to undergo intensive training on cultural sensitivity, bias awareness, and how to handle traffic stops without making assumptions about people based on their race. This training wasn't just for Harris. It was for all officers in the department. The leadership team knew that this was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed at every level. They implemented new policies aimed at preventing racial profiling and improving communication between officers and the communities they served. The department began holding regular workshops on bias and fairness, and officers were encouraged to reflect on their actions and the impact they had on others. For Harris, the consequences of his actions went beyond just the department's investigation. The public had heard about the incident, and people were watching to see what would happen next. The embarrassment and the weight of the situation were heavy on him. His career was on the line, and he knew that he had a long road ahead if he wanted to regain the trust of his colleagues and the community. Meanwhile, Judge Wright continued to speak out, using his platform to advocate for meaningful change. His actions had sparked a movement, and now, the focus was on making sure that the justice system lived up to its promises of equality for all. While the investigation into Officer Harris was just one part of the larger conversation, it represented an important step in the right direction. For the city, the events of that day served as a reminder that change was possible, but it would take everyone working together to make it happen. It wasn't enough to just acknowledge the problem. Real solutions required action, accountability, and a commitment to building a fairer, more just society. The incident between Judge Marcus Wright and Officer Doug Harris had started as a small moment, a routine traffic stop. However, it quickly became something much bigger. It sparked a conversation that went beyond the courthouse, beyond the police department, and touched communities all over the city. What began as one man's experience of unfair treatment was now the starting point for much-needed change. As the weeks went by, the city saw the impact of what Judge Wright had done. His decision to speak out had inspired others to share their own stories. People from all walks of life, including teachers, business owners, and students, began to open up about their experiences with racial profiling and biased treatment. It wasn't just a few voices anymore. It was a whole community standing together to call for a more just and fair society. The local news outlets continued to cover the story, and soon, national media outlets picked up on it too. The situation was no longer just about a judge and an officer. It was about the broader issue of fairness in law enforcement and how the justice system treated people of different races. The more people talked about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern that needed to be addressed. One of the biggest changes came within the police department. After the internal investigation into Officer Harris, the department didn't just stop at training for one officer. They recognized that this was an issue that affected the entire force. New policies were put in place to prevent racial profiling, and all officers were required to take part in regular workshops on bias and cultural sensitivity. The department took steps to rebuild trust with the community, holding public forums and town hall meetings where people could voice their concerns and offer suggestions for improvement. Meanwhile, Judge Wright continued his efforts to push for change. He became a vocal advocate for police reform and worked with local lawmakers to introduce new legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement. He also began speaking at community events, encouraging others to stand up and speak out against unfair treatment. His voice, once limited to the courtroom, had become a powerful tool for change. The community responded with overwhelming support. Activists and organizations that focused on social justice and equality saw Judge Wright's actions as a turning point. They rallied around his cause, organizing peaceful protests and campaigns that called for reforms in law enforcement practices. Judge Wright was proud to be part of something larger than himself, but he also knew that the fight was far from over. It was just the beginning of a long journey toward true equality. The officer involved in the traffic stop, Officer Doug Harris, also faced consequences, but it wasn't just about punishment. It was about learning and growth. His required training helped him understand the impact of his actions and how to approach every situation with fairness and respect. Though it was a difficult road for him, he ultimately recognized the need to change his mindset and become a better officer. His story became a reminder that even those who make mistakes can learn and grow if they are willing to face their shortcomings. For the city as a whole, this incident served as a wake-up call. People started to realize that change was possible, but it required everyone's involvement. It wasn't just about one judge, one officer, or one traffic stop. It was about creating a society where fairness and respect were the standard, not the exception. The change was happening, and it was happening because people were willing to speak up and make their voices heard. In the end, Judge Wright's decision to confront the officer and publicly share his story had far-reaching consequences. What began as a small moment had blossomed into a movement that would continue to shape the future of the community. For Judge Wright, it wasn't just about his own experience. It was about ensuring that future generations would live in a world where justice truly meant equality for all.